Yes, it is.
It's good work.
Good work. Yeah. Yeah. What's our time here anyway? Not ready to start? I don't know. You guys tend to start on time or?
Everything changed at this church. Oh, they had a rector here that they let go. We're in like transition. Demographics are changing. It's passing. We have some little events coming up in Ojai. The podcast is helpful.
Where are you guys in?
Pasadena, we live in Marty's. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so happy.
Yeah, we saved it. Yeah.
Great.
Raising my kids in that house. My daughter's in Marty's office. Yeah, it had a bad foundation. It had bad wiring. It had to bring it up to code.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Because of course
We're in.
we had so many good times.
I was going to ask you if you wanted to pass by or if you wanted to we're there.
We might take you up on that.
All right.
Let me just. Yeah, please do.
Okay, so Susan is not interested. I'm gonna. I would obviously not prepare.
You know what? You say just what you want to say. Emphasize that we have books over there. Well, if we sell all 8 books, I'll be happy.
Yeah, well, and we have a list that we can. Do you
Is
want
this normal for people to sit way back there?
Yeah, and then
Because they
people
can
will.
see the screen there?
I just think it's comfortable, and then people will eventually, as people come in, start to fill in up front.
Okay.
And folks do trickle in over the course of 9 to 9:15.
I get it. Thanks, Geza. So we should probably start on time though, because people leave at 9:45. Right?
Yes, well, the clergy have to, because they have to go get vested, but you're welcome to stay with whoever wants to stay. But we try to end about 9:45. The streaming, he has to leave at 9:45 because he has to go set up for church. Yeah. So yeah, aim for 9:45. But if there is ongoing questions, whoever, we kind of do like, oh, it's 9:45. Like if you need to, you're welcome to, depending on what you want to do, happy to stay to put more if there's still energy.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay. Let me just. I was like, where's my phone? This is great. This is good. Geza.
Geza Toast.
Right? He,
Lives in Marty's old.
that's right. And I met him at California Pizza Kitchen. Was with the guy who lived, who got me my house, my new apartment, the clergy, was friends with him and gave us tickets to a concert. Now I just think of him because I went to a concert that gave me tickets to, but I've never met him. Oh yeah.
And then let's go. Hey, love, what happened to my coffee?
You need to end by 9:45. Are you dying of allergies today? I am too.
Oh.
So you're not alone. Yeah. Everything's blooming.
Okay, yeah, I told him, 9:45, and then everyone needs, and if people want to linger and talk with him, they can do that,
Sure.
but, yeah, we've got to get out, yeah. Okay. All right, good morning. It's 9 o'clock, maybe even a little after, so we're going to get started. My name is Sarah Nolan. I am the Director of Development here at All Saints Church, and Really, really happy to see everyone. I'm also incredibly excited to introduce our speaker for today, who is a good friend and mentor for, I think, almost the last 20 years. And I actually met Ched Myers probably 2007, 2008, so almost 20 years, through potentially initially Marty Coleman and through Knox Presbyterian All Saints Church when there was work happening around Sabbath economics. And so just Ched has been someone who has been an influence on my own personal journey, my own theological and biblical journey, and I'm so grateful to have him here. Ched Myers is a fifth-generation Californian. He is an activist theologian who has worked in social change and radical discipleship movements for more than 45 years. And he just released his new book called Healing Affluenza, Resisting Plutocracy. And he's here to talk about that today. Ched.
Good morning, everyone. How many of you are suffering from allergies this morning? Just a few of us. Being fifth-generation Californian does not make you immune from allergies. Thank you for being here on this early, beautiful San Gabriel Valley morning. I'm feeling very much like I'm way up here and you're way back there, but if that's where you feel comfortable and you can see the screen, I am going to use the screen because we are going to look at some scripture, and it's hard to look at a text without having the text. So I've got it reproduced. So if you can't see the screen, and by seeing the screen I mean actually see words on the screen, do feel free to move up more to the front so that you can. Thank you, Sarah Nolan. Sarah and I met for the first time just over in the plaza here at McCormick and Schmick's. Is it still McCormick and Schmick's? No, it's not. Okay. Anyway, y'all remember that there. And that's where we met 20 years ago. And she was discovering Sabbath Economics and about to start a wonderful project called the Abundant Table Farm Project, which the Episcopal Diocese helped support. And that was up in Ventura County. That's where Elaine and I live. That's my partner Elaine over at the book table. There's just a couple of you that I know, but this is not my first rodeo at All Saints, which I'll speak about in a minute. But I really only have 30 minutes, and I want to introduce you to this new book because it seeks to address our historical moment, particularly around the issues of the deepening crisis of persistent socioeconomic disparity. This crisis of the increasing polarization of rich and poor threatens social coherence, democratic prospects, and ecological viability globally and in this country, and we are seeing it unfold in real time right now, aren't we? The intensification of social and economic stratification over the last decade in the U.S. has ushered in a new Gilded Age. You remember the first Gilded Age, which was in the late 19th, early 20th century, in which America was ruled by robber barons and corporate moguls. Does that sound familiar? So we are right back into that situation, and the crisis continues to deepen, as this piece in the New York Times earlier this week wrote. The surge in U.S. wealth has been driven by stock and home values, but the gains are completely concentrated at the top. In the last 25 years, $79 trillion of wealth has been distributed from the bottom to the top. There's no way that our democracy can survive, and there's also no way that our planet can survive, because rich folk have disproportionate impact on the environment. So the book that we're selling back there argues that our scripture offers an alternative economic cosmology, narrative, and ethos, one which represents ancient medicine that can help people of faith muster the moral and political imagination necessary to survive the brimming apocalypse of economic dehumanization and ecocide that is well upon us now, so that we can play our role in healing what is truly a terminal disease, both politically and personally. So this work arises from half a century of learning, teaching, writing, and organizing around what we at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries call Sabbath Economics. The book focuses on Luke's story of Jesus and charts a path for how the church might preach, teach, study Luke in this year C lectionary, right? So we're about a third of the way through year C, and Luke is coming up almost every Sunday in the lectionary, and so this is the time for us to get our heads around this vision, because we are, without a doubt, under a gathering storm of authoritarian plutocracy, the rule of the rich, not to mention amidst the latest wars of the rich on the poor in places like Ukraine and Gaza. So this morning I want to look at one core sample from the book as an example of how we can read Scripture economically in order to read the economy biblically. But before we turn to that, I just want to acknowledge the cloud of witnesses and particularly remember this woman. How many of you knew Marty? That would be most of you, of course. A prominent leader in all things faith and justice here at All Saints. She's pictured here in her two favorite spaces, demonstrating in public for a good cause and enjoying her garden. And I'm so pleased that Geza Tokes and his family are now resident in that beautiful home, which hosted our cooperative in so many events, both in that home and garden. Marty was a great collaborator with many of us around Southern California. I first met her in 1988 when she invited me here to All Saints to lead a Bible study using my first book, Binding the Strong Man, which is a reading of Mark's Gospel, in a room just above here. So it's fitting for me to call her name as we talk about this latest and likely last major writing undertaking for me. So Marty Coleman, who was memorialized just in the Learning Center last year, is truly with us. Marty Coleman, presente. So I want to, in trying to figure out which text to choose as an example of the work of this book, I decided to take the story of Luke's version of the story of the anointing woman because it seemed fitting because it is today's lectionary gospel in John's version that you'll be hearing over in church. So I hope it sparks your interest, and if so, we have copies. Do we still have any? A few more copies. Yeah. Yeah, that's our cost. So this is the story of an inconvenient, importunate woman at a banquet. And it was clearly an important one for the early church, more central, I dare to say, than it is for our churches today. It's one of the only episodes to appear in all four Gospels. And as I say today in church, you'll hear John's version. There are two basic iterations of the tale. One is found in Matthew and Mark, in which the episode takes place at the house of a certain Simon. There, it's Jesus' head that is anointed, and the focus of the conflict becomes whether the ointment this woman used was too precious to waste. This scene effectively opens up the passion narrative in those two Gospels and concludes with the aphoristic declaration that this story should be told in memory of her, a decidedly untraditional use of that Eucharistic formula. In John's version, it's Jesus' feet that are anointed with a woman's hair, as in Luke, but the setting is different. So John's essential plot conflict basically conforms to that of Matthew and Luke, Luke's telling shifts the focus of the tale from the cost of the ointment to the politics of table fellowship. In fact, this is the most extended single narrative of a meal table in our Gospels. It is quite distinct, and it represents what some scholars call a kind of ancient short story. And that's how we're going to read it this morning. So these are the parallel texts here. As you know, stories, as anthropologists tell us, represent a universal human lingua franca, intelligible to all of us, but they're also highly cultural contextual, like language itself. So this slide reminds us of the basic elements of narrative, and we're going to walk through Luke's amazing short story, scene by scene. Begins with an invitation. That's a formal request. Jesus accepts it without hesitation. He apparently is always looking for a free meal. And he reclines at the table, not sitting, but lying, as was the case in Mediterranean culture. The fact that the host had a table means that he was an elite, because peasants would be on the ground. Our assumption as readers is that Jesus' place at that table would have been one of honor. But alas, salvation draweth nigh. Thank you, my love. But alas, this will be shown to be otherwise at the end of this story. The plot immediately thickens with the appearance of a woman, such a kind that is of the city, clearly a euphemistic phrase for the oldest profession. The narrative appears to accept the description of her here as a sinner. Now, that's going to be contested, but from Luke's very first meal story, way back in chapter 5, which you see here, this social label is one that is constructed by Jesus' opponents to describe the people Jesus hangs out with. In that episode, a repentant tax collector throws a reception for Jesus in which debtors and debt collectors share in a kind of redistributive jubilee fellowship. The first of many indications in Luke that Jesus' new discipleship community will exhibit a socioeconomic character that overturns conventions and defies boundaries, birthed always at the common table. So this is the first time in Luke's story that the Pharisees criticize Jesus for violating social boundaries. It's a conflict that will pop up throughout Luke's narrative. Think of the Pharisees as local authorities trying to keep law and order. We know them. You're right across the street from them, I believe. So this inaugural meal episode sets the table, so to speak, for our story in Luke 7, which similarly takes place at the table of a Pharisee's house. Now, in Luke 5, back in Luke 5, Jesus' famous response to their criticism about the healthy having no need for physicians could well be paraphrased, look, only those who experience the system as broken will try to fix it. That's a good word to us. Well, this woman shows up having learned that Jesus was there. How did she learn this? Social media? Word on the street? This suggests a couple of things. First, that she had a previous relationship with Jesus on the basis of which she felt enfranchised to join him wherever he was. Secondly, we might wonder, deliciously, how did she know where Simon lived? Been there before, perhaps? In any case, it's clear that hers is a bold and transgressive move. She brings with her a precious gift. Some would say it's the tools of her trade. Now, in John's version, the room fills with aroma, as you'll hear a little later on. In church, it makes this a story for all the senses. Here she stations herself behind Jesus at his feet. Whereas in all other three versions of this episode, the focus immediately zeroes in on the scandalous cost of this balm. Here, our attention is rather drawn to her weeping, the pathos of which is underlined by her washing of his feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. This truly is a spectacle from the perspective of first century propriety. A social outcast, unclean and uninvited. A woman with her hair unbound in public. Remember that in those days, all women wore the hijab. On top of all that, she's having what could be called or interpreted as intimate, even erotic contact with a purported prophet in the exclusive company of elite males. Whatever else this is, it's manifestly an etiquette train wreck for the host. So we don't miss the awkwardness of this moment. Luke uses a narrator's power to slow down time. He intensifies the description. She was anointing and kissing affectionately, same verbs that are used in the prodigal son story where the father welcomes back the son, describing the verbs that are in the imperfect tense. So this is signaling a long duration, rather awkward. In other words, this went on for a while. We can imagine Jesus leaning back, enjoying the pedicure, a little to the right. Yeah, that's beautiful. Can you imagine how the tension built in that room for the spectators? Let's go deeper into the central role of women's weeping. In the patriarchal honor culture of Mediterranean antiquity, it was women who typically took on the role of public displays of grief. This is still true in many respects in our culture. Real men didn't cry. Thus, at the end of Luke's story, Jesus says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but for you and your children." But Jesus himself is a critic of this division of emotional labor. In fact, weeping has already been important in Luke's larger narrative, beginning with the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus pronounces, "Blessed are those who weep now." And in defending the work of John the Baptist, Jesus laments to the crowd, "When we wailed, you did not weep with us." There are multiple other stories in Luke in this vein, not least when Jesus weeps over Altadena toward the end of the story, a trope that is only found in Luke. The Greek verb kleio denotes bitter wailing, and some of you have been in cultures where wailing is very loud and very disruptive. It's cathartic. So Luke portrays Jesus as carrying on this point in tradition of the weeping prophets of the Hebrew Bible, such as Elijah, lamenting the prospect of violence that will be wrought by the king of Aram on his people in 2 Kings, or Jeremiah, lamenting the coming destruction of Jerusalem and exile to Babylon. True prophecy is not about foretelling the future, but understanding the consequences of bad national behavior, speaking unpopular truths to those living in denial, and above all, grieving publicly. That's a good word to those of us trying to confront our moment. The fact that women carry disproportionately the emotional work of weeping and wailing in traditional societies, therefore, is a sign of their prophetic character, as so poignantly expressed in Picasso's Weeping Woman. There's about 25 different versions of Picasso's Weeping Woman. Amazing. Talk about cathartic. Does this resonate for you as you read the daily news of genocide and the destruction of democracy? It is true that the cacophony of tears, naming pain and injustice and hardness of heart, can be hard to hear, especially for comfortable people. But the very fact that this woman is unnamed in Luke's story gives us space to hear the sound of wailing women today, having their children taken away at the U.S.-Mexico border, vigiling in public plazas in Latin America, demanding justice for the disappeared, standing in the ruins of bombed-out buildings in Gaza or Ukraine. Yet in Luke, this archetypal llorona, the weeping woman, she somehow knew that her tears and all they held would be received by Jesus as a weeping prophet. And so they were, which is why it's worth lingering over this moment in the story, straining to hear her lament and our own. But suddenly the focus of the storyline shifts. The camera swings around to the Pharisee who invited him. Luke shows us the host's vigorous internal dialogue. Yeah, I'll bet he was muttering to himself. At the center of his concern is not this woman, as importunate and inconvenient as she is. Rather, he questions Jesus' putative prophetic credentials. He should have known what kind of woman this is who is touching him. In the mind of this elite male, this woman has 3 strikes against her. She's not from there, a kind of class dismissal. She's inappropriately touching an unrelated male in public, and most of all, she is a sinner. So we've arrived again at this powerful omnibus social stereotype, that the host resorts to name-calling. That's all he needs to know to dismiss her. Friends, we are in a moment where our politics has risen through a strategy of dehumanizing public name-calling and scapegoating in the Trumpian era. But the fact is, we all succumb to dehumanizing labels and generalizations, even if they just resound in our head. Objectification leads to violence. We've seen this repeatedly in our societies, from kill the Indian to save the child to keep out immigrants because they're rapists or terrorists. The host's thoughts, right, this is an internal dialogue, reveal that he's only concerned with male honor, both his own and that of his guests. In this shame and honor culture, the purpose of throwing a party for other elites was to build prestige. Think of this as Mar-a-Lago. But to have them shamed by this behavior means that the host would be ruined politically. He has a right to be concerned. Luke's portrait paints a room with air as thick as smoke as the awkward silence and tension builds and builds. For how long? On one pole is the astonishingly inappropriate displays of affection happening around Jesus. On the other, the weaponized, objectifying thoughts of the host, so loud you can almost hear them. Awkward silence, why you no end? Which brings us to scene 2. Jesus finally breaks the tension by addressing the host by name. Simon! Perhaps as an effort to personalize and thus humanize the deteriorating situation, to try to move beyond stereotypes. I have something to say, Jesus offers, ever ready to interrogate difficult realities. I would imagine that Simon virtually explodes. Say something! Explain yourself! Simon does not call Jesus by name, only by his purported title, teacher. Simon is furious, desperately hoping for some explanation, some rationale that will rescue him from this complete social disaster. Tell me my life isn't over. Is this some kind of joke? Some of you come from gesturing cultures? Give me a gesture. Give me a gesture, not the middle finger, but some kind of gesture that you might throw in here. Come on, we got to feel this story. Like, ay vey, or, right? I mean, actually, this story is better shown than told. It's so poignant. Talk about difficult conversations, and they're all over now. So, it's a pretty bad moment. Another one to linger on, feeling the social discomforts, right alongside the woman's weeping. Now watch what Jesus does. Having been finally given the floor, he changes the subject entirely by proceeding to tell a story that seems to have no segue. It's not labeled as a parable, but clearly it is one, right? Parabole, put side by side, used 18 times in Luke. Parable spinning, after all, is in the prophetic lexicon. It's the way of speaking truth to power. Think Nathan and David. But parables at first are disarming because they speak in a language that a suspicious audience can hear. And suddenly, Jesus seems to have Simon's attention. I mean, the scenario Jesus poses is one that is familiar to the host because the host is likely himself a creditor. Perhaps an explanation for this scandalous behavior will now be forthcoming. The story is straightforward. It's about those who can't repay their debts. Yeah, Simon knows all about those people. Debt default. And from the lender's point of view, he awaits Jesus to pronounce a righteous judgment on all the stiffs who couldn't or wouldn't pay, as happens so frustratingly often. Unfortunately for Simon, he wasn't around earlier in Luke's narrative when Jesus taught in his sermon on the leveling plain about the ethics of lending. Making a loan for purpose of return is no credit to the lender, Jesus says, ironically using both a blend of both economic and moral language. This is reinforced later in Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, which uses the same liberation verb, aphiemi, for forgiving sin and debt, thus equating the two. Similarly here, Jesus' little parable at Simon's banquet has paralleled debtor with sinner. And I suspect it's to illuminate how this weeping woman was forced onto the streets because her desperate poverty, bred by indebtedness, could only be addressed in this manner. Jesus, having broken the awkward silence, now proceeds to make it more awkward. He concludes his parable abruptly by matter-of-factly stating that the creditor, without explanation or justification, gifted them with remittance. The verb charizomai is related to the word for grace. This is the surprise parabolic twist, because that's not what creditors typically do, or mortgage lenders in the wake of a fire, I might add. It's a happy ending for the debtors in this story, not so much for Simon and the other creditors at the table. And to complete the train wreck for Simon, Jesus asks him about his opinion of this turn of events in the parable, wondering aloud not about the rationale for this sudden jubilee, but rather about which debtor might have been more grateful. This is a picture of sports doctor Larry Nassar a few years ago. He was in the news when he admitted in court to sexually assaulting athletes when employed by Michigan State University and U.S. Gymnastics. It's a look of complete resignation, shame, fear, and defeat. And I imagine that must have been the look on Simon's face. As completely demoralized, he musters the obvious answer to Jesus' rhetorical question, I suppose. He's been backed into a rhetorical corner, forced to publicly acknowledge the alternative world of grace and reciprocity. No doubt, surely, Jesus responds, well, duh! Which brings us to the third and final scene of this drama, in which poor Simon's night is going to get even worse, because he's clearly not getting it. Jesus turns from comforting the afflicted woman to afflicting the comfortable man in a way that will radically redistribute social power. Scene 3. Notice the politics of gesture here. And this is not captured in any classical or modern art that I have discovered. They always get it wrong, where he's looking at Simon and gesturing to the woman. But the text says he turned to the woman and said to Simon. So he's looking at her and talking to him. That's powerful politics of gesture. We've arrived at the heart of the story and perhaps the punchline. Do you see this woman? Of course Simon has seen her, but only as a stereotype, only as a social disaster. He has not truly recognized her as a human being with a story and a heart and indebtedness, treating her instead as invisible among his invited company of elite males. To venture a contemporary analogy, It's no accident that this very question is the slogan for a group called A21, which deals with human trafficking, particularly in the sex trade, which they call the disturbing truth which hides in plain sight every day. So much is invisible to us because we have been dismissive of that which is inconvenient. Now comes the big reveal, in which we learn what happened at the start of the meal. In a string of emphatic contrasts, notice the direct indictment of Simon, addressed in the second person, you, contrasted with a commendation of the woman in the third person, she. Remember, he's talking to her, he's talking to Simon, but looking at the woman. I want you to feel this gesturing. Look at this string. There's no way around it. This is an extraordinary public shaming of a powerful male leader. And in case you think that Jesus is just being too harsh here, recall the previous slide. Invisibility kills. This is brave space in which Jesus unmasks the social veneer of civility to unveil injustice and disrespect. You see, his litany reveals that our initial assumption, right, that Jesus had been welcomed as a guest of honor, was entirely wrong. In fact, Simon neglected to observe even the basic laws of Middle Eastern hospitality when Jesus arrived. No bathing, washing, no greeting, no welcome. In other words, Jesus too was invisible among the elites. With each of these three contrasting iterations, the field is being leveled. The woman's marginalization is being erased by appreciative recognition, while the man's honor is being chopped down to size, his entitlement exposed as inhumane and unacceptable. Don't give me the stink eye. I didn't write this stuff. This story is an enactment, we might say, of the lullaby that Jesus' mama used to sing to him when he was a baby. The lowly will be raised up and the proud brought down. The vision of radical redistribution of social power takes flesh here when Jesus comes over for dinner. So we might want to think twice before we invite him to our parties. To put this in more contemporary terms, in the aftermath of the famous Watts Rebellion in our city in 1965, our country's greatest prophet proclaimed famously, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And isn't here Jesus, in collaboration with a weeping woman with little to lose, isn't he throwing something of a riot in the middle of this distinguished dinner party? One that disturbs the peace of elite males in order to make injustice visible. Now comes yet another punchline. This is why I'm telling you, this indicates solemn emphasis. Jesus doesn't deny that this woman has been involved in, shall we say, questionable transactions, but he continues to humanize her, recognizing her agency as someone trying to heal, her agency. Verse 47 is usually translated, "Because her sins are forgiven, she loves much." This is the way that we try to domesticate these texts, but the Greek actually reads, "Because she loved much, her sins are forgiven." It's this woman's proactive love that has actually animated grace. And then, so no one will miss it, he explicitly affirms that indeed her sins are forgiven, using that Jubilee verb again, which in Luke can connote healing from illness, release from debt, or leaving one's status quo in order to follow in discipleship. The religious leaders gathered around the table would have themselves been in charge of administering the forgiveness business, which is why at this point, all hell breaks loose. Now all the fellow diners get into the act, echoing Simon's exclusive concern about Jesus' putative status, full of theological outrage at how he is usurping their role. The dudes are melting down. But at the eye of this hurricane, Jesus retains his singular focus on this woman. The men around the table still haven't truly seen her. They're only offended by Jesus acting up. But Jesus refuses to yield to political pressures of orthodoxy, steadfast in his mission to overthrow every regime of dehumanizing invisibility. So he simply offers the still unnamed woman, again, a cipher for every woman who has had to endure the violations chronicled by the Me Too movement. He offers the customary Hebrew benediction, go in peace. That her own faith has liberated her is his final acknowledgement to her dignity, a commendation he often uses in the gospel with the marginalized. So concludes this crazy, contentious tale. We don't know what happened next or the long-term effects of this disaster at Simon's pad. But Luke does tell us one thing, that in the immediate aftermath of this encounter, suddenly a whole bunch of women start gathering around Jesus. Portrayed here are not only marginalized women and those finding healing from illness and poverty, but women of means as well, who are now helping support the movement. One scholar notes, women leaving behind family responsibilities to travel would have been considered seriously deviant. Jesus seems to have changed the rules and expectations of long-standing cultural norms around gender, and Luke, more than any other gospel, affirms the critical and pivotal place played by women. Maybe not seeming so revolutionary today, but in the first century, my Lord. Luke's epilogue deepens the impact of this short story. This discipleship community is now fully revealed as inclusive across class and gender lines and explicitly embracing Sabbath economics. Just as Jesus' parable about debt forgiveness turned the social focus of the scene at Simon's table into an economic polemic, these women are making their material means available, embodying the Sabbath economics lessons from the confrontation at Simon's house. It signals a return to the old ways, a community operating as an alternative extended household economy, oikonomia, which traditionally in the village was managed by women. And what of the weeping woman? Well, we can presume she is now a sister and perhaps a leader in this newly organized female community, having found a home in the house of Sophia. Well, I suggest two morals to the story. This is one. In the U.S., we think of women like Dorothy Day, Dolores Huerta, or Ella Baker, who disrupted the peace in order to advocate for a more just peace. And secondly, never underestimate the strategic power of disrupting a meal. Because our greatest social movement started or was revived by the great sit-in movement in Greensboro on my birthday, February 1st, 1960, the most important social movement birthed at the table after having been animated in the basement of black churches. So this is Luke's short story, scandalous, revelatory, and coming to the lectionary near you. Except, oddly, in Luke's year C, it comes up in John's version. So I hope you enjoy the gospel reading today, but think of it through Luke's eyes as a lesson in Sabbath economics. Now, I'm mindful that in 4 minutes, you are going to be called to the big house to hear the gospel. But I'm wondering if there's one or two people who just want to say, this is kind of, do you need to make an announcement? Oh, the microphone. If there's a word or a phrase or an emotion that you have, just give me three more minutes and we'll get to. Thank you. So anyway, that's a little bit of a core sample from the book. reading the Bible economically so that we can read the economy biblically. I saw, yes.
And I just want to say there are how many books left? 5 copies left. And also Elaine Inns has written a book, Healing Haunted Histories, which is another one to check out. But yeah, words. And if you need to get to church, feel free to do that.
Thank you. My name's Patrick, and really appreciate your word, but I wanted to just ask you what you thought about this. I feel like we're all implicated in the very system that's killing us, and there's no way to walk away and say, oh, I'm with Jesus, so I'm good. And I wondered if you could speak to that just briefly.
Yeah. Wendell Berry says it this way: we are we are dependent upon a system we know is wrong, and yet we feel powerless to do anything about it or unwilling. He says, but that is the addict's excuse, and it will not do. And I think addiction recovery paradigm is one that we all should take very seriously right now. Yes, we are all implicated in this, and we all need to go into profound practices of recovery. One of the appendixes of this book talks about some resources for both personal and political forms of economic recovery from the addiction of affluenza. So thank you. Yes, that's very true. Yeah.
It's just like me. I want to share an example I've been thinking about since yesterday. Earlier this year, I saw a painting. Your use of art is, just incredible, by Tissot of, quote, the widow's mite. Mm-hmm. And it's Jesus, a really great redheaded looking Jesus. At the
Irish Jesus?
I think maybe. Anyway, the woman is in the foreground and she's walking away, very, very, dark and with an infant. And what do we, as to your point about how we trivialize or exploit the gospel, the idea when you think of the widow's mite is give everything, give whatever you've got, just give. Yep. And what is really obvious in that painting is that she's on a very, very thin ice. Yep. She's lost her husband, she's walking away into who knows what darkness, and there's a kind of a shrewish looking patriarch in the background.
This is a great example of the way in which our churches domesticate these stories, because the widow's mite story is often used in conjunction with stewardship Sundays. Look, here's this woman giving the little bit she has to the church. Whereas in the actual texts in the gospel tradition, Jesus excoriates the tax redistribution system, which it was at that time, that functions to advantage the rich and punish the poor. This is not a commendation of the widow. This is a lament for how the system is screwing her. And so part of this exercise and this kind of work is to encourage us to recover the Bible that speaks truth to power. And the more we can read these texts economically to replace them in their actual social economic context in order to make them sing and speak in our own social and economic context, that is got to be one of the vocations that we work to rehabilitate in our communities of faith. And hopefully books like this can be resources for that work. Maybe we have time for one more. Dear Natalie.
Thank you very much for the use of narrative.
Old friend and colleague.
Old friend, long time. The use of narrative, I think, is really important for us today, and you've been using this since Binding the Strong Man. So I think there's much more in common that we all have, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, red, blue, whatever we are, telling stories together, and not trying to make ideological points. Yeah. And that's what this is showing. The stories of the Greensboro, young people at that desegregating that lunch counter, and the stories from the Bible. Yeah. So that reminds me how important that is for all of us to talk with those across divisions because we're all in this together, and that's the only way. Yesterday was a good point about that. I mean, there were people out there, whether they voted for Trump or not, who were demonstrating, who were protesting across the country. So thank you for reminding us, which you've been doing all along, all through your work of telling the story, telling the narrative, and inviting others to tell their story, and finding that common ground so that we can work together.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I can end with this benediction coming from Leslie Silko, one of our great Native American novelists, who writes in her book Ceremony, "I'll tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. Stories are all we have to rescue us from illness and death. The evil out there is great, but it cannot stand up to our stories. So they want us to forget our stories or get confused about our stories, because then we are defenseless. So let us embrace these stories, go deep, and then bring them into the public square as the word of liberation." Really appreciate your attention. Thank you, All Saints.